We had just looked at chapter 3, verses 5 to 9, where Paul explains that leaders like Paul and Apollos, that they're fellow workers in building God's church. And so they shouldn't be pitted against one another as competitors. Now, the fact that Paul here refers only to himself and Apollos, and you see the same thing in chapter 4, verse 6, that may indicate that the problem with the factions began with or centered on the differences between Paul and Apollos in terms of rhetorical skills. That may have been the origin of this lining up behind different teachers that you see there. You recall that Apollos, he's described in Acts chapter 18, verse 24, as an eloquent man or a learned man. So he apparently had been schooled in the art of rhetoric. So he was somebody who understood these rhetorical techniques, and he could compete at that level, whereas the Corinthians said Paul's speech was of no account in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 10. But Paul's point here is saying, listen, we're all on the same team as teachers and preachers, and we shouldn't be pitted against one another. Now let's pick back up in chapter 3, verse 10 to 15. He says, according to the grace of God that was given to me, I laid a foundation as a wise master builder, and another is building on it. But let each one watch out how he builds on it. For no one is able to lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone is building on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, the work of each will become obvious, for the day will make it clear, because it is to be revealed in fire. And the fire will test the nature of each man's work. If the work that anyone built on it shall remain, he will receive a reward. If the work of anyone shall be burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. So Paul elaborates here on this metaphor that he introduced abruptly right at the end of chapter 3, verse 9. Remember there in chapter 3, verse 9, he says, for you are God's field. Then he says, God's building. He abruptly introduces this idea of the building, and then he elaborates on it here, on that metaphor for the church, God's building. He talks about that. And he says he laid a foundation as a wise master builder, meaning that he had preached Jesus Christ crucified. So he'd laid that foundation as a wise master builder, and now somebody else is building on the foundation that Paul had laid there in Corinth. And he's not referring to Apollos here. When he says someone is building on the foundation that he laid, he's not referring there to Apollos, because Apollos is no longer in Corinth. And you can see that in chapter 16, verse 12. But Paul, he warns those in Corinth to watch out how they build on the foundation that he laid. And in verse 11, he makes clear that they don't have an option of laying another foundation. That's not an option for them. As David Garland says, they can only add what the foundation will bear and must not exceed the limits or introduce confusions which would change the character of the building so as to threaten its eventual collapse. They must use fit materials and follow the plans of the architect, who is God, not Paul, and the building code. You see, the truth about how they built or shaped the church by their teaching or their influence, the truth of that will be revealed on the day of Christ's return. If they built the church through their teaching or influence according to God's will, if they built the church in the way that God wants the church to be, well, those changes would carry over or continue into the consummated kingdom when Jesus returns. They would continue into the eternal state. They wouldn't be lost through the purging out of all that is contrary to God's eternal vision. See, to the extent you build consistent with God's eternal vision, the fruit of that labor will continue into the eternal state. To the extent you build contrary to God's eternal vision, such as through worldly evaluations that result in division, well, that's not going to come through because there's not going to be division. So that will get purged out. So this is what he's talking about here. See, and all of the things that you build that are consistent with God's eternal vision that come through, for those things, you will receive a reward. You will be praised. As you see in chapter 4, verse 5. If they built the church in a way that's not suited for God's eternal vision, not suited for the consummated kingdom, if they created those beliefs or practices that were inconsistent with that eternal vision, so as I said, such as that worldly perspective that leads to factions, well, the fruit of that labor will be purged out at the consummation. In other words, that work was of no lasting value. You see, they will be saved, those who built on the church in a way that was inconsistent with God's eternal vision. The fruit of their labor will be purged out, but they will be saved, but he says, only empty-handed. You see, only empty-handed, only as one who has escaped from a fire that consumed all things. So you think of a picture, somebody who comes out, everything's been burned up. You see pictures of people, I lost everything. Well, that's the image. Those who don't build rightly, those who don't build consistently with God's eternal vision will have no carryover for reward where God will say, well done, and they'll receive praise. Now, he's not talking here about heretics who themselves will be condemned. He's talking about people who built inconsistently with God's vision. That work and that labor will not come through. They will not get praise from God for their labor, but they themselves will come through, but as one who has nothing. You see, that's the image now. Now, he warns them in 16 and 17. He says, do you not know that you are the temple of God and the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy this person, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. So Paul, now he tells them this thing about, listen, if you build inconsistently, if the fruit of your labor is inconsistent with the consummated kingdom, with God's eternal vision and purpose, that you will come through and be saved, but your labor will not, and there will be no reward, no praise from God. Here, though, he issues this stern warning to any who would destroy the congregation in Corinth as opposed to incorrectly building on it. You see, there is a point at which incorrect teaching and incorrect practices threaten the very life of a congregation. There is a point at which those things threaten to terminate the group's union with Christ. As you see in Revelation chapter 2, verse 5, Revelation chapter 3, verse 16, where Jesus speaks of removing the lampstand or of spitting them out of his mouth. You see, there is a point where the group simply ceases to exist as a church. That doesn't mean they may not still gather and have signs and this kind of thing, but they're a fake church then. The lampstand has been removed. And so he's warning people here about anybody who does this, a stern warning about anybody who would destroy the congregation, anyone who so warps a church that it ceases to be one in the true sense, that person will himself be destroyed by God. The church is God's holy temple. It is his holy temple. It is the place in which his Spirit dwells, and he will not ignore an assault on the church. See, he will not ignore that. You and I understand that the church is the community of believers in whom the Spirit dwells. That is the temple. And so he will not ignore an assault on it. Now, Paul is content at this point simply to raise this potential of divine judgment without expressly placing the Corinthians' present conduct in that category. He doesn't get off on that. He tells them, listen, there are dangers here. The danger is if you build inconsistently, you will lose the value of all that labor because it won't come over and you won't get praise from God. But there's also a greater danger, that if you so warp the church that you wind up destroying it, severing its connection with Jesus Christ, God will destroy you. You see, so there's an even greater danger. And at that point, he puts that out there. Then he says,